less people in this afternoon, huh? Than this morning.
It will trickle in.
I see. So now we do the questions, and hopefully a couple of the things we talked about this morning become a bit more clear when we're using them in form of questions. Why don't we start? Let's see. Megan.
Yep.
Blake.
Yeah.
Peter. Eric. Good. No.
Yeah. It's okay. Eric's the other agent.
Oh, that's happening. I told Tim I never have these issues. No,
That's cool.
I lost big time.
You're not the first.
Welcome to Denver. Everyone is white here. Like the first thing my wife said when we moved here, she's Indian. She's like, dude, it's like everyone is white. It's true. Like hipster white here. Sorry, but what was your first name now again?
Jack.
Josh. Okay. Good. Let's go in a row. Megan, why don't you start with the first question? Read it loud. Read out loud for everyone.
Okay. A patient undergoing a lap appy was induced with propofol, fentanyl, and succinylcholine. When his body temperature rises to 40 degrees Celsius, his end tidal rises to 60 despite efforts to increase minute ventilation. What's the preferred treatment option despite supportive treatment?
Yeah. I guess besides supportive treatment would be the appropriate English.
Am I supposed to answer?
Yes.
Okay. I would say dantrolene.
Yes. So what is your thought process here?
It seems like malignant hyperthermia.
Yeah.
Succinylcholine can do that.
Yeah. What else? Succinylcholine is the one big one, and there's
gases.
Rephrase that term. You're thinking the right thing.
Volatile anesthetics.
Very good. Why do I make a difference between gas and volatiles? Anyone?
Oxygen.
I guess. There's another anesthetic, which is not a volatile. Very good. And is nitrous oxide triggering malignant hypothermia? No. Not as far as we know. So, yeah. Volatile anesthetics and sucks are the two big ones. The reason I was making this question up because obviously we talked about CO2, and we always know that we always watch our entitled CO2. Now we have someone with an extremely high metabolism, so basically a malignant hypothermia. Our muscles are burning a lot of oxygen down to CO2, and one of the first signs is actually that the CO2 is rising as a sign of increased metabolism. So an extreme form of what we talked earlier today. If you have someone with sepsis, thyrotoxicosis, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, serotonin syndrome, any form of condition which increases your metabolism, you might actually in the operating room encounter that your CO2 is going to rise. And the most rapid rise you're probably going to see in this condition, malignant hypothermia. And you will see it eventually in your career. Have to draw up dantrolene, which is the biggest fun factor. It takes like 10 people to get that diluted down. Okay. So, right question. Okay. Next question.
Right after an induction for lap appy, the blood pressure cuff is unable to measure the patient's blood pressure. What is the appropriate next step of action?
Maybe also read all the answer possibilities.
Sure. Change position of blood pressure cuff. Recycle blood pressure cuff immediately while checking end tidal and carotid pulse. No action requires blood pressure cuff is often inaccurate. Cycle blood pressure in 3 minutes again. Push 500 phenylephrine.
What do you think?
I would probably do B.
Which one? Sorry?
I would B.
B. Yeah, that's right. First of all, it's the longest answer, and that's usually it. And this is referring to what we talked about earlier today. So we talked about how your entitled CO2 can tell you something about metabolism, and it can also tell you something about perfusion, right? So right after induction is a common scenario. Your blood pressure goes down, right? Pushing a bunch of probes, sometimes we push too much, and our blood pressure is tanking. Our blood pressure cuff now has a hard time picking up the blood pressure because the pulsation is so low that it can't read, and usually tells you like low pulsatility or something like this, and it stays blank. And very often that's wrong. It's actually just not doing its job. And if you recycle it, you get another appropriate blood pressure, but sometimes it's actually right. And my first thing is, if that happens right after induction, is that I just real quickly make sure that we actually have a pulse. That's not the reason that the patient has become too hypertensive during induction. And the next thing is actually that I take a look at the entitled CO2. What would be an appropriate entitled CO2 to confirm that our cardiac index is normal? Talked about this briefly this morning.
You said 20 to 25 at least.
Yeah, very good. They have done studies, and if you have an entitled of 20, your cardiac index is usually 1.6 to 1.9, which is basically close to normal. Good. Okay, I guess you could change the position of the blood pressure cuff with A, but first of all, I would make sense. The first and foremost priority is to make sure the guy is actually getting blood flow. All right, next question. That's a tricky one.
Imagine the following scenario. A patient with stable blood pressure is intubated with a PEEP of 5 and flow by oxygen, but no set tidal volume or respiratory rate. After some time, the patient's saturation drops. What is the mechanism of the patient's hypoxia? Atelectasis. I just got some PEEPs. Upper airway obstruction. Dead space ventilation. Shunting or dropping alveolar oxygen. I think it would be E, because the CO2 is eventually going to crowd out the O2, the alveoli, and it'll become hypoxic. But you can make it like 10 minutes or something, right? You pre-oxygenate.
Very good, first of all, because most senior residents have this right. Obviously, this will never happen in that scenario, but this is basically a reflection of oxygenation versus ventilation, right? You probably all have learned that ventilation is basically just eliminating CO2 and that oxygenating is providing O2. You probably also learned that oxygenation is driven by PEEP, by patent airway, and by FiO2, while getting rid of CO2 is basically terminated by your ventilation, by respiratory rate of minute ventilation. However, like if someone stops breathing, even with a patent airway, eventually they're still going to die from hypoxia. And as you said, the reason for that is that the CO2 is going to accumulate in the alveoli, because it doesn't get taken away by ventilation, and eventually basically takes the space of the O's in the alveoli, and you can't oxygenate anymore. And if you go through the answer options, it cannot be atelectasis because of the PEEP, right? It cannot be an upper airway obstruction because the guy is tubed, right? Cannot be dead space ventilation because the guy doesn't get ventilated. And it cannot be shunting because the airway should be open. So whatever blood flows through the lungs should meet open alveoli. And is there any formula you have learned in medical school which reflects that exact concept we just described? That it must be the alveolar O2 which is dropping.
It's like partial pressure of atmosphere minus water minus CO2 over what is it?
So you got 2/3 of the formula. Very good.
Yeah.
That's more than most. What's the name of this gas? What's the name of that formula? It's actually very simple. The alveolar gas equation. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the formula. So you basically see the large A stands for alveolar, and what you see is basically dependent on the FiO2 you're giving, obviously, and on your atmospheric pressure. You're going to subtract the water vapor pressure, because that's usually something we only have in our airway, but it's not really in our atmosphere that much, at least it's like an absolute minimum. And then we subtract this CO2 from it as well, because the CO2 is yet another thing which we're exhaling, but it's not that much in atmosphere, right? Does anyone know how much? That doesn't really matter. It gets too far, but we all talk about greenhouse effects, but CO2, while CO2 contributes to it, the overall percentage in our atmosphere is extremely low. It's like 0.04%, while oxygen is 20% and nitrogen is almost all of it, like 80%. But that's why you have to subtract those two components, the vapor pressure and the CO2. And the RER basically stands for the respiratory quotient. That's basically referring to your metabolism, like based on your diet. If, for example, you mostly have in average, we have a 0.8 respiratory quotient. It's basically reflecting of how much O's you're giving the body and how much CO2 comes out of the body. And depending on your diet, if it's carbohydrates versus fat, that ratio goes either up or down. Yeah, that's not so important. You just put in 0.8. Does anyone know what normal atmospheric pressure is? Not in Denver, but in San Diego. Yeah. What's the normal vapor pressure in our body of water? It's like 47. And then a normal FiO2 in our atmosphere would be 0.21 if you calculate it this way. Good. Enough theory, a little more clinical practice.
A patient's end tidal CO2 decreases while the PA CO2 increases. Which of the following conditions is an explanation for the scenario above? A. Decreased cardiac output. B. Pulmonary embolism. C. COPD. D. Answers A and B. E. Answers A, B, and C. P, little a, is that artery or alveoli?
Little a is arterial CO2. So this is the so-called anterior to end tidal CO2 gradient, right? We saw the gradient is usually just 3 to 5 because of some dead space in our airway, but it increases in certain conditions, right? So this is a scenario of increased dead space. Come again? So C is right, but there's a bit more to it. There's something else is also right.
A and B are also right.
Yeah, why is that?
Because you have decreased end tidal from low cardiac output, and you're not using it, so your PA is also up. So you're not ventilating out as much as well.
Yeah, so basically, both in decreased cardiac output and pulmonary embolism, you're not perfusing your lungs appropriately, right? In a pulmonary embolism because there's an obstruction, and then decreased output just because you're globally not perfusing well, including your lungs. So you're not getting the CO2s to the lungs, right? And that basically leads to the fact that you're ventilating the lungs pretty well, but you don't have the blood flow. So it's yet another increase in that space. In COPD, it's a bit more, that issue is a bit more based on the lungs, where we have a lot of alveolar breakdown because of the emphysema, and a lot of the alveoli don't participate in gas exchange anymore. So we're pushing air into those spaces, but they don't participate in gas exchange. So yet another form of increased dead space. So the right answer is E. That's my mistake. Sorry, guys. It's E. It's E. Forget about what you just saw. Okay, next question.
After intubation, your capnography tracing is obtained. This waveform is most consistent with following scenarios: spontaneous respiratory effort, incompetent expiratory valve, esophageal intubation, or bronchial spasm. Let's see. I don't know what incompetent expiratory valve would be like.
It's probably not that then.
Esophageal intubation. I'm not sure how high that peak is. Like, it'd be nice to have a scale, but let's just say this is right after your intubation.
So you're saying it would be nice to have a scale. What happens with the CO2 tracing at the end?
It's 0.
Yeah.
So, I'll say it's probably esophageal intubation.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, because bronchospasm, you would get a lot faster drop. And then maybe, like, you would get, like, you get that, I forgot what that's called.
Not sure what they look like, but we're gonna have a question about bronchospasm in a little bit. So you're right, esophageal intubation. So there's some CO2 in our stomach from, it's like a breakdown products of the bacteria. So for that reason, if you intubated a goose, you're gonna have some CO2 in the beginning, and that's why everyone always tells you to give 5 breaths before you actually are reassured that your capnograph shows you CO2 tracing, because you have to get, it could be possible that you have a positive trace for the first time, and then after 5 breaths, when that CO2 is eliminated in the stomach, it's running down to 0. But if you only look for the waveform for the first or second, you're like, okay, everything worked well, until your saturation goes down and you realize something happened in the meantime. So that's referring to this. So this time the square is right. All right.
Each of the following will alter the position or slope of the CO2 ventilatory response curve except hypoxemia, fentanyl, and 2O, isoketamine.
Yeah. You guys remember that, I'm not going to give it away, but you remember that graph I showed you this morning? Actually, I can show you the graph because, unless you know the answer already, let's go this way. Want to give it a try?
I can give it a try.
Yeah.
Let's do N2O.
All right, that's wrong. It's a bit more tricky question. Here we go. So that's basically how the graph looks like, right? And it's basically a reflection of the fact that if your CO2 builds up, that you're going to start or increase your minute ventilation to get rid of that CO2 again. That's all it says. Now, if you're under anesthesia, you probably noticed your patients don't start breathing, partially because you might have paralyzed them as well. But even if you haven't used any paralysis, the patient is still going to be apneic. Unless you'll get the CO2 to rise to a certain point. So now what you see with narcotics, you probably all know that narcotics make you apneic or hypopneic. And if you illustrate it graphically, is that you don't start breathing until your CO2 gets higher. You can actually see that where it says morphine, but you can put in fentanyl or whatever for that name. For most other anesthetic agents, and the graph is a little bit flawed because barbiturates are an anesthetic agents, you also have a shift to the right, but you also lower your angle, right? So not only do you start breathing later, you also don't create the same minute ventilation as you're supposed to do, right? I don't know if you will see it, for example, in pediatric people, when you breathe them down on volatile anesthetics, they're still going to breathe, but they're going to breathe very shallow. They're not going to move much effective alveolar ventilation because they're just moving that space back and forth. So now you know that anesthetics shift this curve to the right and drop the angle. If you look on the left side, you see that acidosis and hypoxia make you breathe actually a bit sooner than you would usually do, right? Makes sense, right? You want to get, with acidosis, you want to get rid of CO2 to make your pH neutral again, and hypoxia you also try to fix by starting to breathe again. So, with that said, let's go back. You might still not have the answer, but that's fine. But you can, okay, now you have the answer. So what does ketamine, what the other agents don't do?
Ketamine doesn't affect spontaneous ventilation, right? Like,
That's exactly
that's why you want to use it.
Associated, so
Yeah.
so the brain still functions.
Yeah, so it gives you anesthesia, but you don't stop breathing. Exactly right. Is there a similar agent, by the way, which does something?
Etomidate?
No, usually not. It's just so shitty that it doesn't get you under. You can push a whole syringe of etomidate and the patient's still going to be looking at you. I'm not lying. It's so bad. That's why it doesn't drop the blood pressure. It doesn't do it. It's like normal saline.
Oh, dang.
normal saline with adrenal insufficiency. There's another agent which is relatively new.
Is it president?
Yeah, very good. Very good. It's kind of a similar, it's not the exact mechanism, but similar. So those two agents don't suppress your breathing. Very good. They're making progress.
No, it causes bradycardia.
And drops the blood pressure.
Yeah.
But the bradycardia seems to be a bit more profound, yeah, you're right. And maybe the bradycardia is the reason why you drop the blood pressure. Okay.
A patient with a history of chronic lung disease who received minimal perioperative opioids is known to be somnolent in the PACU while receiving supplemental oxygen. Which combination of arterial blood gas results is most likely for this patient?
You don't have to read all the numbers. In this case, you can just tell me what your guess is and why.
He's got chronic lung disease,
Mm-hmm.
opioids. So he's likely, oh, this is what you were talking about earlier, where you like you overflood them with the oxygen. So it means like you are retaining CO2.
Mm-hmm.
So your PaCO2 would be high, so it would be B or K. And your PaO2 would also be high, so maybe B.
B, very good. So, getting a bit more complicated, this guy has COPD at baseline. So he's probably retaining at baseline. He's probably not saturating in the hundreds the whole time. He's probably like living somewhere in the high 80s, low 90s all day long, right? Doesn't get narcotics. I said this because I wanted to make sure that no one thinks that that's the reason the guy is retaining. But he gets supplemental oxygen. And he probably sees more oxygen than he would ever do at home, right? And his saturation is probably now fixed. It's like in the hundreds. PACU nurse is super happy now. Until she calls you, because the guy needs to be re-intubated. Has happened in the ICU as well. It's, what happens here is basically that you lose your respiratory drive if you supplement too much oxygen to someone with chronic lung disease. And the mechanism of that, as we talked about earlier, is not fully understood, but most pulmonologists these days say that it has nothing to do with necessarily our brainstem. Like in the old days, people were just saying like if our brainstem sees too much oxygen, it thinks it doesn't, like our respiratory center thinks it doesn't have to drive our ventilation anymore. Doesn't seem to be this way. Also makes sense that it's not this way because there's no O2 receptors actually in the respiratory center. It seems to be more related to the fact which we call hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. So usually, as this guy has COPD, he's hypoxic already, right? Chronically hypoxic. His lungs have adjusted to this. The territories of his lungs which get perfused, the territories of the lungs which get ventilated very poorly, such as atelectic areas or emphysema territories, therefore see less blood flow in order to avoid shunting, where you run a bunch of blood through a territory which doesn't participate in gas exchange. Instead, it tries to distribute all the blood flow to the territories which actually do get ventilated, and therefore fixes not only the hypercapnia, but also the oxygenation issues. You get rid of this mechanism if you give this guy too much oxygen. You're basically dilating the vessels which have been previously constricted, and you're basically starting to shunt a lot of blood through territory of the lungs which don't get ventilated. It's a bit complicated, but I hope it makes sense. Yeah. So, while the mechanism is not that important, the end result is the same, right? If you give someone with chronic lung disease too much O's, you take away, maybe not the respiratory drive, but you basically get them to a point where they're going to retain CO2, where the pH goes up and where they become more and more obtunded. And in this specific example, I tried to make a point of where that oxygenation is not really the issue, because the PO2 on that example is 120. trying to show with that it's not really an oxygen issue. Like he doesn't see enough oxygen. As a matter of fact, he sees too much oxygen. Yeah? You want to keep these patients at the set where they usually live at, otherwise they're going to end up on BiPAP or re-intubated. All right. I think that's a bit easier here. Let's see.
A patient with bowel ischemia is in the operating room for an emergent laparotomy. At the end of the case, the patient has an elevation of 15 on PSV, and his ABG is a FiO2 of 40%, shows 7.20, 30, 120, and negative 10.
You know what the 15 and minus 10 stands for? So 15 is the minute ventilation, so 15 liters a minute. The minus 10 is the base deficit. Okay.
What is your next step of action? Right. So he's acidotic.
Very good.
CO2 is a little lower than probably would like it.
Okay. So I didn't crunch the numbers to make this ABG accurate, but what can you tell by a low pH and a low CO2? What kind of?
It's medical.
Okay, very good. So that's important to know, to understand what I'm getting here at.
Right. So if we're looking at a metabolic acidosis, I would probably go with C.
Okay.
I would neutralize the metabolic acidosis. Except the bicarb is probably going to wear off pretty quickly.
Very good.
We'll be in the same spot.
But now the tube is out.
And then we're in a bad place.
So what's
The answer is never bicarb.
unless you're cardiac arrest, it's never bicarb.
Or diarrhea.
I guess, yeah. So here's the situation. If you give bicarb, what happens with that bicarb?
Your liver has to process it.
It turns into more CO2 that trends along.
Yeah, and if you pull the tube in the meantime, what's happening to you? What you're going to try to do? You're going to try to breathe off that CO2, right? Yeah. On top of that, you already have a metabolic acidosis, so what are you doing already? So you're already trying to get rid of acid by breathing it off, right? So you're already hyperventilating. That's where the 15 meters per minute of pressure support come into play. This guy's already hyperventilating, right? So it's already working hard. Now, if we give bicarb and we produce more CO2, it's going to work even harder. And in that question, I also pulled the tube. So now it's going to work even harder. And he's extubated. What's going to happen next?
You're going to have to re-intubate.
Because he's going to tire out, right?
Yeah.
He's going to first get very tachypnic, and then he's just going to stop breathe because he can't catch up anymore. So what's probably the right answer here?
Keep intubated.
Yeah. And what does the ICU have to do first before he gets extubated?
Correct.
By bicarb or by what? Probably fluids, right? So this guy is under resuscitated. He developed a lactic acidosis. His base deficit went up. And you're going to have these scenarios all the time. You're like, okay, I'm going to extubate him. It looks great. He's breathing very fast, so he must be ready. His O's are great. What else is there to ask for? Yeah, so that needs to be corrected first. The surgeons are going to ask you this, why can't you just extubate this guy? Well, because you lost too much blood. Or in this case, he's just having a lot of acidosis from his ischemia. Okay, good. Important concept. If you know this, you already know more than the second years. Good. Next question.
Apnea test performed on a presumably brain dead patient. How long will it take before PaCO2 raises by 20 millimeters of mercury?
Does everyone know what an apnea test is?
Yeah.
When are we doing it? Come again? When you found this swimming pool. When you're presumably brain dead, right? And you want to test someone for brain death. So usually if you don't have, a cranial nerve exam and no other response to your environment, then you do another confirmatory test, and the apnea test is the most specific of all the confirmatory tests. There are other things you can do, this is the best. Has its limitations though, especially if the guy is not healthy, he's not going to tolerate an apnea test. Let's presume this guy is going to tolerate it. So what basically happens is a guy is intubated. Now we're going to do exactly what we did in this other scenario. We're going to keep some PEEP going. We're going to turn off the vent, but we're going to give him some flow by oxygen because we don't want him to get hypoxic, right? We probably want his organs to get donated. But we want to see, what do we want to see in an apnea test? When is an apnea test negative?
They breathe.
Yeah, that's what we want to see. Why is that the case? If you breathe, you're clearly not.
Right.
Yeah, because your brainstem is still working. Where's our respiratory center? Where in the brainstem? Very good. And? Yeah, very good. Pressed. Very good. Not that matters to this question, but so this is a purely mathematical question. And the criteria, you can basically stop the apnea test after your CO2 has increased by 20 millimercuries from your baseline. So say your baseline is 40, if you get up to 60, you can abort the test. It's going to be positive for brain death. What they oftentimes ask in the boards how long this takes. And while this is not completely accurate, it's a good rule of thumb to know for every one of you guys. We talked about this morning, but I don't know if anyone read actually the small paragraph below. It was under the ventilatory response curve.
I'm going to guess they made this criteria at nice round numbers, so I'm going to guess B.
It's good 6 or 8. This is pure guessing.
Do you guys, so to get you there, do you guys know how much the CO2 rises in the first minute of apnea?
Is it 4?
It's a little higher. 6?
6.
Okay.
Not first minute.
And then second minute?
Okay, so it's 4. It's 12.
3. So another 3. So first minute is 6. For the second minute, you add another 3. So then you're by 9. I don't know if you meant this by 12 by saying you just double it.
No, it's just you're saying it's not linear.
It's not linear, correct?
That's so surprising. Why is it not linear?
Not completely sure. My assumption is that you basically, I'm not going to make anything up and lie. But the first minute is 6, the second minute is 3, then every consecutive minute is 3 again. So I don't know, I gave you the answer, just have to do the math.
So it's 6.
It's 5.
C.
Yeah, so 6 minutes, right? It's like 21 and 6 minutes. And it's 18 by 5 minutes, right? Yeah, so by 6 minutes later, you're probably going to get there. I don't know if there's going to be, like, why might this question actually, like, despite that the board is asking these questions, if you're actually in the ICU, why is this actually important to know? Yeah, because otherwise you have no idea, right? You have to make your ABG count. You draw 1 right before when the test starts, and then you're like literally doing like this. You're looking on your clock and you're hoping the guy doesn't reset in the meantime. And you want to make sure you draw the ABG to the right moment. Because if you draw it at 5 minutes and then put the guy back on the vent, and your CO2 has risen by 18 points, you can start all over again. Yeah. So if anyone wants to become an intensivist, since you guys didn't know, you should actually let me know. But okay, next question.
Stephanie, you're up.
Dang. A patient with acute pulmonary embolism in core pulmonale on TE needs to be emergently intubated for acute hypoxic respiratory. The central line is in place after induction. The anesthesiologist is unable to mask ventilate the patient. Shortly after, the patient's CVP rises while MAP drops until he becomes apicitile. What is the most likely etiology of his hemodynamic instability?
question is very easy if you look at the right word here. So all these questions are related to something we talked about this morning. You're probably the VA, so the way it looks like, yeah.
Yeah.
Can still figure it out though. Any takers?
C.
CC? Yeah, very good. Why?
Because it's hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. NESP.
Yeah, so exactly. So I put some little hints there. So the key is that the guy already has some RV strain because he shot a massive PE and that was already seen on TTE. And now on top of that, and I mean this is a common scenario that you have to intubate a PE patient. Now on top of everything, the anesthesiologist is unable to mask ventilate. So what's happening to your CO2? What happens when your CO2 goes up to your PBR?
What's up?
What happens to your RV if your PBR goes up? Goes down. What happens to your CVP when your RV goes down? Yeah, exactly. So those are the little keys there. All the other scenarios were kind of more vasodilatory states. Yeah, I mean hypovolemic and vasodilatory states are usually those scenarios.
So what do you do in this scenario?
You better get a tube in quickly.
So if you ventilate and you get anesthetics and you can, I guess, get some of that constriction off?
Yeah, so basically the way I do this, I don't even induce this guy without any RV support. So if I induce someone with RV dysfunction or acute decompensated RV dysfunction, I usually start some dobutamine before I even do anything. And the key is basically that you get them ventilated one way or the other as soon as possible. If you have some dobutamine in place, you're going to buy yourself some time, right? Because even if your PBR increases, your heart is now stronger and can push against it. It's not going to get rid of the PE, but dobutamine has two effects. It's a positive inotropic agent, so the RV gets some more help, and it also lowers your PBR a bit.
Which pressor?
Dobutamine. It's not a pressor, it's an inotrope. Very important difference. What's a pressor?
Vasopressor, causing constriction.
Yeah. Give me 2 examples. Phenylephrine, yeah.
And
Yeah.
norepinephrine.
Yeah, norepinephrine is kind of a middle ground, right? Because it has a bit of both. And then dobutamine and marinone are pure inotropic agents. They actually do some pulmonary vasodilation. So in that sense, they're doing the complete opposite of pressing, basically. But those are the drugs you want to give for your RV. So you buy yourself a bit of help here. And usually, most of us would actually just tube the guy right away. They wouldn't even try to mask ventilate the guy. They would just get the tube in as soon as we can to make sure that we can ventilate the patient again. So that's the second part. You take the risk, obviously, if you never try to mask ventilate and now the intubation is also difficult, then you're in a really bad spot. But on the other hand, you save some time by putting the tube down and not making the patient more hypercapnic. You saved yourself some time, got the CO2 down again, you might save this guy's life. Good.
What would you use for induction patient with like
Yeah, I mean, if it's like an emergency, I like to use ketamine with Versat. There is a theoretical concern that ketamine actually increases your PBR. But more importantly, every other agent, including propofol, even etomidate, or whatever you want to choose, they do something else. They lower your blood pressure systemically. And if your systemic blood pressure drops, your coronary perfusion pressure drops with it. And if your coronary perfusion pressure drops, especially the right coronary artery, your right ventricle gets even more ischemic. So I like the benefits of ketamine to keep the blood pressure up during your induction. And it has another advantage. If I'm really in that situation that I cannot mask ventilate or intubate a guy, I only have to reverse my paralysis, the rocuronium, which you guys get raised in a very luxury situation because now we have Sugamidex, which gets you out of trouble within a minute. So I only have to reverse the paralysis, and ketamine is not going to suppress the guy's respiratory drive, so hopefully he will stop breathing again. Exactly right. Sugamidex is millennial.
Oh, sorry, Sugamidex is millennial.
It's so easy. No, but you'll learn to reverse with new sticking as well. But
Get some mission for it.
but that's why I like to use ketamine for these scenarios. And you will see different preferences with different anesthesiologists. But I put this down here because we have the scenario all the time in the CT ICU, and I just want you to become vigilant that there might be ongoing other issues. DRB might grab out, or ICP issues, which I think is our next question. Maybe I start with this question here. Let's do this one.
During an evacuation of an intraparenchymal hemorrhage, the surgeon asks you to target an end tidal CO2 of less than 35. By what percentage does cerebral blood flow change for each millimeter of mercury increase in PAC?
Increase or decrease, by the way. I misphrased this question. Obviously, he wants to get the CO2 down, so I should have written down decrease in CO2. So basically, just treat this question: what percentage does cerebral blood flow? By what percentage does the blood flow change for each millimeter mercury decrease in CO2? We talked briefly about it this morning, but I'm pretty sure the question will still be answered incorrectly because it's a little bit of a mean question. It's a board question.
So it goes down 1.
Very good.
It's like 1 and 1.
Very good. So it's 1 and 1.
But
So
it's percentage.
very good. You got it. Nice.
So
Now you need to know what the normal cerebral blood flow is.
yeah.
It does. It does. Look at this plateau here.
So it's like 50.
Very good. So let's go back.
Okay, so
I mean, this is a
so
general.
hold on. So the surgeon has to target less than. So okay, so if you go down by 1 at a 50. So
Yes.
it's 2.
Very good. Congratulations. That was, I think it was one of the toughest questions. Yeah. And you actually went through it correctly, so they actually asked us on the boards. That's why I put this up here. You have to remember some of those numbers. It's like with every test, you're just going to have to remember it. And a couple of things you should remember is the 50 cc's per 100 grams per minute is the regular blood flow to the brain. They say that in gray matter it's 75, in white matter it's 25, so it averages down to 50. The gray matter is where all the cells are sitting, that's why they need more oxygen. And you have to remember that you go down by 1 for CO2 and blood flow. So first, you go down by 1 millimeter mercury, you go down by 1 cc. And then you just have to keep an eye on if they're trying to trick you with percentages. Good.
So wait, what's that? Okay, so it's milliliter per 100 grams per minute.
Yeah, so milliliter refers to blood. 100 grams refers to brain tissue.
Okay.
So if you would take 100 grams of brain tissue
Okay.
and you want to calculate how much blood flow goes through it, it would be an average 50 cc's per minute.
Okay.
So that's what that means.
Is there like a average brain weight that we think of? Like how many grams of brain does a normal person have?
Yeah, there it is. And I would have to Google it right now.
I can Google it, that's fine.
But they're not going to ask you that, hopefully. They didn't ask me that, so I hope they leave you guys
Okay.
alone. Yeah.
Weight of human brain.
In grams.
What is it?
Average weight of human brain. Major environment. Pounds.
Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. very heavy in this room. Very light in some of the ORs. Just kidding, don't write me up.
1,400 grams.
Okay, so it's basically 14 times more. So 14 times 50 will be 1,700.
Huh? That's 14 times
700.
750 cc's.
Right? 700 cc's per minute.
cc per minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
So your brain sees your regular cardiac output is what? Per minute?
1.6, 1.9 liters per minute.
How much was that?
Sorry,
Well, it's in
for index. That's what it
cardiac
is.
output.
It's like 5 liters.
Yeah, very good. So 4 to 5 liters. About 700 go to the brain. So it's a seventh of your blood flow, I guess. Doesn't. Yeah. You can. Let's move on.
During positive pressure ventilation, the following capnograph tracing was obtained. This waveform is most consistent with which of the following situations? Spontaneous respiratory efforts, Curare cleft, leak in the sampling line, or bronchospasm. D, bronchospasm.
Yeah, why?
Typically, that upsloping on the initial part of the capnography kind of signals some kind of obstruction. It's pretty steep, so probably bronchospasm.
So you remember when we, so usually it looks, okay. So you said some right things. So usually it looks pretty much like this.
Right.
So usually you have like a immediate upslope. Once you overcome that space, that's basically when CO2 comes from your alveoli. Then you stay at that level for a long time because your alveoli are starting to empty. Then you start with inspiration again and everything goes down. And this plateau phase still has, it's not really a real plateau, it still goes up a bit. But you can definitely see how it's kind of plateauing. In someone with bronchospasm or COPD, you don't see that. Does anyone know why? Why don't we really reach a plateau? It has to do with the pathophysiology of COPD or bronchospasm for that matter.
They don't have laminar airflow because the diameter of the airway is so small.
Yeah, what does it lead to during exhalation?
Ignited expiratory phase.
Yeah, so you need longer to exhale, and because it is not the same for all the bronchioles in your respiratory tree, your airway tree, some areas empty quicker than others, and that's why you never reach that plateau where you in some airways you're still emptying that space because it's so hard to get the air out, and in some other airways you're already exhaling alveolar gas, and that's why you don't get that plateau. Does that make sense? So basically, where you basically lost the plateau, you now have partial dead space getting exhaled and partially alveolar space getting exhaled. If that makes sense. Yeah? You're just gonna, at the end of the day, you're just gonna remember the waveform and know what it is.
During positive pressure ventilation, the following capnograph tracing was obtained. The waveform is most consistent with which of the following situations? Well, I thought A and B were similar things. So spontaneous respiratory efforts, Curare cleft, leak in the sample line, or cardiac oscillations. So testing. I mean, I actually thought it was a Curare cleft.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I should have left A alone. Because it's confusing. Spontaneous respiratory efforts are basically is referring to something else, but it's the same physiology. So you think it's the Curare cleft. Why is that the case?
Because you have the patients trying to inspire during expiration.
Yeah.
And the machine is making them expire or pulling the air back out, and they're trying to suck it back in and generating some negative pressure against the line, making it cleft.
Does that make sense to everyone? So while you're exhaling, the guy already tries to breathe again. That's why your CO2 intermittently dips down again. but the machine is still in the process of exhalation, so the machine is going to win because the guy is not strong enough to breathe against the machine. Once the guy actually has like intermittent breath between the set respiratory rate, that's usually what people refer to as spontaneous respiratory efforts. What you usually see is like this, like a normal waveform, and then something like this. Then you see normal one again, and then you see something like this. That's what people refer to spontaneous respiratory efforts, but you're right, I made it more confusing because strictly speaking, the coronary cleft is also an attempt for spontaneous breathing, okay? Cardiac oscillations.
What is that? What is that?
So when the heart, like the heartbeat, is messing with your capnography. Yeah, it can. It looks, I don't know if I have, it looks similar, but the difference is that you basically, when you have the waveform, you have like little oscillations on it, and it goes with the heart rate. So if you compare it to your EKG, it's way faster. You only have one coronary cleft usually when someone tries to breathe against it, but your heart rate, you usually see multiple oscillations on the same waveform. I can show you guys a picture in a second. Oh, there we go.
During positive pressure ventilation, the following capnograph tracing was obtained. This waveform is most consistent with which of the following situations? A. Spontaneous respiratory efforts. B. Carotid cleft. C. Cardiac oscillations. Or D. Stuck expiratory valve. I would call that C. Cardiac oscillations.
Very good. Why is this important to differentiate from coronary cleft or spontaneous respiratory efforts?
There's nothing to do about it.
Because you might paralyze the patient based on it.
Yeah. So you want to avoid like giving him more anesthesia or more paralysis for the wrong reasons, right? Very good.
Can that oscillation change like based on certain physiology, or is that just like, hey, this is what it is?
You mean if the heartbeat gets stronger, if you see it more
like,
pronounced?
if you give it like a inotrope, is that gonna?
Theoretically, it should, yeah.
But it's not important, right?
So, like clinically, I think it's not significant. Like what I can tell you from experience is you either have oscillations or you don't have them, and most of the time you actually don't have them. But it's basically from the vibration of the heart,
Right.
kind of working a little bit against the heart, against the lungs. So basically, the oscillation is pushing like the heartbeat. I mean, the heart is basically right next to both lung lobes, right?
Yeah.
And like just pushing a little bit against the lungs is going to keep that little.
I was thinking like if you have like pericardial effusion, you might not have that or something. It's like
That's probably true, yeah.
Pathognomonic.
Yeah. So unfortunately, you don't always have oscillations. If you get an effusion and tamponade, you might not pick that up. I mean, it's a good thinking process, but clinically, unfortunately, we don't see oscillations in every patient. So if they're gone all of a sudden, you can't just say like, the guy must be tamponading.
Mm-hmm.
If that, you know what I mean. That's a good thought process.
If anesthesia machine is discovered on Monday morning having run at 5 liter per minute oxygen all weekend long, most reasonable courses to take for administering the next anesthetic would be A, turn off your machine for 30 minutes before induction, place humidifier in the line in expiratory arm, avoid using SIBO, or change the CO2 absorbent. Let's see. I think this is like you're trying out your absorbent and then becomes more reactive with whatever anesthetic you're replacing, and you get some byproduct.
Yeah, what's that byproduct?
Some bad stuff.
It's one of them, yeah. It's one of the byproducts. Yeah, very good. Very good, guys. You know more about machines than I do. So this scenario can actually happen. Like people, like for example, someone was on call on the weekend and they just kept on running the oxygen, and basically carbon monoxide basically for multiple reasons is causing issues, right? Or the cups there's nothing more to say. Like basically carbon monoxide has a higher affinity to which molecule in our body, hemoglobin, than O2. And obviously carbon monoxide will not be useful in our mitochondria to produce ATP. It's going to be the complete opposite. Carbon monoxide takes the space of oxygen in hemoglobin, and you become hypoxic in a very interesting way, because people don't even realize that someone gets hypoxic, because what is your SpO2? What's your pulse ox telling you?
A lot of them.
Yeah, so because carbon monoxide, hemoglobin, like carboxyhemoglobin, is on the same on the same light spectrum as oxygenated hemoglobin. So your pulse ox gets fooled in believing that the oxygen is actually oxygenating well. How can you find out that that's actually not true?
You guess it's co-symmetry. Co-oximetry thing.
Yeah, or maybe easier.
Turning blue.
Actually, no, that's the problem. They don't turn blue because the carboxyhemoglobin basically looks the same as the hemoglobin, so they're still pretty red.
I mean, your CO2 goes down. Wait, no.
You get an ABG, right?
You get ABG, yeah.
So the ABG will actually tell you what, like the ABG is a direct measurement of oxygen. So the saturation measured with an ABG is a direct form of measurement, while an SpO2 is an indirect measurement. So the ABG cannot get fooled. It will tell you the exact PaO2 based on the oxygen dissociation waveform. It's going to calculate the saturation and tell you what the real saturation of your arterial blood gas is. Good. That's what I got. Yes. Who was asking about the other waveforms? So there's way more waveforms. Let's see where I'm headed. We're getting there. Where is it? Here. So there's way more waveforms you have to learn, especially for the boards. Bronchospasm and COPD look very similar. These inspiratory and expiratory valvular issues is something you just have to learn. Pregnant women are a little bit like COPD patients. The coronary cleft is back again. CO2 rebreathing is if you don't let someone exhale long enough, and before they eliminated all their CO2, they start inhaling again, and that's why you never get the CO2 down to zero. We talked about esophageal intubation. We talked about spontaneously breathing patients. There's some weirder stuff if you have two different capnographs there. Malignant hyperthermia is basically when your CO2 just keeps on rising on the same respiratory rate and the same minute ventilation. We talked about cardiac oscillations. And there's some other fancy stuff, but basically for the boards, they actually just asked us like 3 of those. And it's usually the big ones. It's usually rebreathing, F. It's usually bronchospasm, A. It's usually differentiating E from K. And if they have an MH question, they might show you the capnograph for that as well, J. And N, like that's basically just a question about like you measuring your entitled CO2 while you do CPR to assess the quality of the chest compressions. Good. Questions? You guys okay? Good?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. A little longer, I guess. Most people are done after 4, right? Or, no?
People go till
Yeah.
What's the time?
Some people it's like 30 minutes, other people it's an hour and a half.
It hasn't been lately.
Yeah.
An hour and a half. Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That's brutal.
Yeah.